Good afternoon, my friends. This is Paul, and today's video is all about the idea that not believing someone when that person announces his or her Myers-Briggs type could actually be harmful in communication. But before I get into my point, I thought it would be easier for some of you to understand if perhaps I gave an example of another scenario in which this could be harmful. Let's say you have a straight woman who, was woman from birth, so no surgery or anything like that. But despite that, she still decides that she wants to cut her hair so short that it's a boy's cut, as I like to call it, and she happens to have a deep voice. And so naturally, people would assume that perhaps she was a man because she happened to have masculine traits to her. And just to make the analogy go even further, let's say that she drives a motorcycle and plays video games. Further, more masculine type of evidence. And then another straight girl comes along and sees her dating profile and doesn't bother reading the descriptions and says, "Yo, let's date because you look so," I'm not going to say that because that's kind of a slur, but she basically says you're attractive. And the other girl says, "But I said on my dating profile that I'm a woman and I want to date other guys. You're a girl and no offense, but I don't want to date you." The other girl responds, "But you look and sound like a guy, so you must be a guy. Therefore, I must be able to date you." And she's like, "Okay, it would be creepy if I just revealed it all to you. So can't you just take my word for it?" Most of the Myers-Briggs community seems like it's kind of divided on its understanding of how to type people. People can say, "Oh, I've studied the letters," but then there are other people that study the functions, and there are other people that study other communication styles that might not necessarily be part of Myers-Briggs, and so sometimes it can be very hard to have a definitive typing for someone. There are people out there that say, for example, that Emma Watson is an ISTJ, but then there are other people that say that she's an ESTJ. Now, despite there only being one letter difference, and despite those two types sharing a function stack just in a slightly different order, that would radically change how a person would communicate with Emma. If she was an ESTJ, she would be more impressed by results and empirical data, whereas if she was an ISTJ, she would probably want things to be more explained step by step, and she would probably also want things to be more familiar. So very, very different priorities. Now, going back into my type, let's say for the sake of argument that I actually am an ENFP, as some people have proposed. If that were the case, then I think most ENFPs would generally want to feel like their creativity isn't restrained. And so, coming from other people, they would probably want to have more of a spontaneous, flexible, "Hey, I've got an idea, let's run for it" type of attitude. And so I think if I was an ENFP, then a person approaching me who had a wild idea or wanted to just do something on the spot wouldn't be afraid of approaching me with such an idea, because they'd say, "Oh, well, you're an ENFP, so you shouldn't have a problem with that." The thing is, that's not true. That isn't what I would like. For me, I'm the type of person that I communicate in a very step-by-step, concrete, literal type of manner. But that's not typically how ENFPs communicate. So therefore, if I said, "Hey, I'm ENFP, but this is how I communicate," the Myers-Briggs world would probably see that as a little bit of a contradiction. Like, wait a minute, if you lead with extroverted intuition, then why are you acting as though your inferior function is the dominant? You see what I mean there? And it's even worse if a person misconstrues my Myers-Briggs type because of their preconceived notions of how an ENFP should be in relation to how I act. So if someone said, "Oh, you're an ENFP, so therefore that means that I should just go ahead and tell you how I feel because feeling types like to be sympathetic for others," and I'd be like, I kind of would have wished for you to maybe ask me permission so that maybe I could prepare myself for the possibility of maybe an emotional dump or something that I'm not ready to conveniently handle. Admittedly, the examples that I've given could potentially be a little bit of a stretch, but the point still stands that when a person announces his or her Myers-Briggs type, it's usually also an invitation on how to communicate. And usually when I think about the Myers-Briggs types of my friends, that also gives me a little hint about how to treat that person. So for example, my friend Joe is an ISTP, one of the only ISTPs I know that's legitimately confirmed to be one. And so I know that when I'm around him, I need to keep the touchy-feely stuff to a minimum, because introverted feeling is his 8th function and extroverted feeling is his 4th. So in other words, he's not going to be putting a whole lot of priority on that function. But if, for example, I didn't know that he was an ISTP and I said, you know what, something is bothering me, let me just express it, that would make him uncomfortable. And I don't think I would like the idea of making my friends uncomfortable unless, I don't know, it had to do with the church teaching or something like that. I think a good friend should respect another regardless of Myers-Briggs type. But the point still stands that knowing that he was an ISTP not only made me respect his preferences to be more logical and, I wouldn't say pragmatic because ISTPs use introverted thinking, but like not bring up a whole lot of emotional stuff, and also not to overly praise him when he would do a favor for me. Like we would have this tradition where every single time our young adult group would go out and hang out at a restaurant, he would always get me apple juice because we'd go to the coffee shop, but I don't like coffee. And after a while, I learned to just keep it really simple and say, oh, thank you. And he would just say, no problem. If I had been overt and said, oh my gosh, you got me apple juice, that's so great, he would have been like, can you tone it down a little bit? That's too mushy for me. So knowing that he was an ISTP helped me to tone it in. Also, if he would ever offer his services on the spot, I wouldn't overly apologize for doing the inconvenience because he's a perceiving type. He's used to adapting on the fly. So a lot of times I would just say like, hey, Joe, would you mind helping me out? And if he said, yeah, sure, then I would say, oh, thank you, and leave it at that, because his cognitive preferences have indicated how he wants me to talk and how he processes information. Similarly, if I came across an ENTP, I would want to make sure that I didn't bring up my reasoning a whole lot, because then they would try to debate with me, and I don't really like debating. I think I'm better at it than I give myself credit for, but I still don't like the concept that people have their own truths and therefore like what's right for you is wrong for another. I don't know, the idea just doesn't sit right with me. But I would also know that if I announced that I was an ISTJ to the ENTP, then the ENTP, if the ENTP was actually considerate, that's another issue, hopefully that person would say, oh, you like things explained more concretely, do you? Well, I'm normally more of a metaphorical kind of guy, but okay, I'll humor you. Again, hoping the ENTP actually does that, because they do have a habit of being like, I'm going to make this person uncomfortable because I know what they dislike. But I don't know, maybe if the ENTP was Catholic or Christian, they might be more willing to compromise. But the point remains that a person's cognitive functions indicate how that person processes information and how much that person engages with the internal or external world. It informs a lot of things that that person would decide on a daily basis. Using another example, because we introverted sensors love our examples, I went on vacation this year to go and meet Isabel. She's an INFJ, and we also had a friend of mine who is an ESFP joining us. And since both of them have extroverted sensing in their function stack, it led to this desire to want to try out a bunch of different restaurants. I, on the other hand, wanted to just stick to Burger King or McDonald's because that's what I'm familiar with. Introverted sensing in general tends to like to stick to what's been done before in that person's personal opinion. And so it was kind of a little bit of a push and pull to try to be like, if you guys want to go to a new restaurant, sure, just don't have me eat anything there. But also at the same time, for them to respect, like, don't go overboard in trying to get me to do new experiences. It led to a little bit of compromising. Like, for example, they both said, like, hey, let's go to the mall. And I'm like, well, I kind of have a budget, but I guess it wouldn't hurt to walk around. And so it was all right going to the mall, but I asked them, well, I didn't legitimately ask them. I think Isabel just detected it because she has extroverted feeling, that if they were going to do anything specific at the mall, that they would ask me first so that my brain, being a judging type, would have the time to process, okay, we're going to have bubble tea. Let me prepare for that. Let's not just throw it on me all of a sudden. And that really helped a lot. But just imagine how chaotic that vacation would have been if I hadn't announced that I was an ISTJ. Just imagine if they just threw me into this new restaurant and we had to eat all the stuff that I had never heard of. I think I would have considered the vacation to be kind of a failure of a vacation. I think I would have said, you guys were being very inconsiderate of me. And they're like, how are we being inconsiderate? We didn't know any better. Conversely, knowing that my friend is an ESFP would have made me have to realize we are on two totally different wavelengths, with her not liking similarities and with me loving similarities. So near the end of the trip, at one point, she said, Paul, I can't stand any more McDonald's. Can we please switch it up? So I said, okay, a decent compromise would be, how about we go to Wendy's? Because that's still similar-ish fast food, but it's a different restaurant at the same time. So that ended up working out with both of our preferences. It allowed her to experience something novel in the moment, and it allowed me to be familiar because I had been to Wendy's before, and it's similar enough to McDonald's and Burger King. Now, that's not saying that you should always 100% never ever challenge a person's Myers-Briggs type, because I think anyone can learn how to develop weaker functions. If you use the Bible as an example, a lot of the Pharisees that Jesus dealt with were probably super hardcore STJ types that followed the law to the letter, to the point where they were neglecting the parts of the law that also talked about kindness and being considerate, such as in the Ten Commandments where it says, love your neighbor as yourself. Actually, that might not have been the Ten Commandments, but it was one of the commandments that God had talked about in the Old Testament. And because they were so persnickety, they couldn't see that the examples Jesus was showing was not disobeying the law. When Jesus offered to heal someone on the Sabbath, nowhere in the law did it say that he couldn't do that. But because it said do not work on the Sabbath, they were a bit too literal about that. And Jesus, he didn't say, oh, well, if you guys are a bit too literal about that, then let me explain. No, he said, you hypocrites, you children of hell, how dare you distort God's law like that? So not only was he calling out their stupidity, but he was also saying, hey, lighten up. Learn how to use your extroverted intuition a little bit to do more outside the box ways of fitting in with the law, while at the same time not being bound to it like a slave. So Jesus allowed them, or not allowed them, Jesus said, don't be limited by your Myers-Briggs type. So in the same way, that could also really help out communications. If someone came up to me knowing that I was an ISTJ, and that person wanted to do something that was more new and unique, I think if that person knew ahead of time what my type was, then he or she would say, oh, if you have extroverted intuition as your bottom function, you probably get a little bit uneasy when people present new ideas. How about this? How about I show you the game first before you play it? That way you don't have to spend money. Then that's a reasonable compromise because I'm still trying something different, but I'm not losing resources all of it, because everyone knows ISTJs are sticklers for budgeting and spending accordingly. So in that respect, that person is challenging me to accept that extroverted intuition is part of my function stack without forcing me to go too far and start being like an ENFP. In a similar way, INFJs can sometimes have their moments where they get so caught up on their own personal logic that they don't see a possibility of ever being wrong. So I have learned, don't argue with them, because that is just going to make them shut down and guard up even more, and then it's a losing battle from there. I've said, have you considered this particular angle? That way it's not coming across as a personal attack, but at the same time, it's getting their introverted intuition thinking like, oh, Paul is thinking about this issue on a deeper level. That is my dominant function. Oh, hey, that's Paul's eighth function. He's actually trying to use one of my strengths to try to communicate with me better. Maybe I can think about this more deeply. And I'd like to think that the INFJs in my life that I've tried this on have actually been willing to challenge themselves. I know one of my friends once said to me, Paul, I never want you to mention the name of my ex-boyfriend again. And I said, okay, sure. But then there just happened to be one day where she herself broke her own rule and said, yeah, it was like that with fill in the blank. I'm not going to say his name for obvious reasons. And I said, wait a minute. You told me never to mention his name again. Why did you all of a sudden do that? And she said something along the lines of, oh, I've gotten over it. So then that prompted me, I forget the whole conversation, but I said something along the lines of, well, if you changed your mind on that, then what's to say that you haven't been willing to be more open to the possibility of being wrong or evolving on other matters? Or I might say, hey, can we work out a way of compromising so that I don't feel as though you are ignoring me or hating me? In other words, I appealed to her need for extroverted feeling. Extroverted feeling is all about harmonization and like taking on the group's emotions and prioritizing them over your own. So by saying, hey, I am feeling uncomfortable, but I also don't want you to feel uncomfortable, that's appealing to two sides at once. On her end, she's saying, oh, this person is comfortable enough to trust me with his feelings, because INFJs are usually the types that are like, come on, tell me, open up to me, tell me your deepest thoughts. Not as forceful as the ENFJs, though. But then the ISTJ is saying, okay, I am going to try to appeal to your extroverted feeling and try to ask it in the form of a question as opposed to a personal attack. If I hadn't known that my friend was an INFJ, I don't know if maybe we would have had that conversation. I think she and I would have probably just said, to heck with you, you're just too complicated to communicate with. There were a few times where I was pretty darn close to doing that. But upon studying the cognitive functions and upon studying how the different positions in the function stack can affect how a function is used, that enabled me to realize how to talk to her in a way that appealed to both of our preferences. One example of where we both compromised on both of our bottom functions is when I was first getting over my aquaphobia. I said, okay, well, my extroverted intuition is now wanting to try this new thing of going swimming. And at first, I was like kind of uneasy about the idea of girls in swimsuits. So at first I said, well, can you maybe like put a shirt on when you're in the pool? And then eventually I said, okay, well, maybe I'm freaking out over nothing, because just looking at a body isn't sinful. It's if you're lusting. So I said, okay, if you want to, wear the full swimsuit. And eventually I got so comfortable with the idea of this new thing of swimming that now it's a regular thing that we like to do whenever we hang out. So on her end, she's engaging her extroverted sensing by saying, okay, the pool's fun. It's going to be like in the moment engaging my five senses. My extroverted feeling is being engaged because I'm helping you to have personal growth over your phobia. My extroverted intuition has been pleased, and since I'm now so used to it, now it's become part of my introverted sensing, saying this is familiar, this is what we do normally. So I ended up taking something from my bottom function and turning it into the top. And she, in turn, used her bottom function of, this is fun, I love the sensation of splashing, into her top function being, oh, there's more to just water than splashing. It can also help a person to overcome a phobia. And that's just a few examples. This video is going on a bit too long, but I hope you guys get the idea that the next time you question someone's Myers-Briggs type and you feel absolutely certain that the person is wrong, maybe ask the person instead, what Myers-Briggs type do you see yourself as in terms of how you want to be communicated to? Maybe say, okay, I think you're an ENFP, but if you say that your communication preferences is that of an ISTJ, then I will respect that. And I will treat you as though you're an ISTJ, even if you're wrong. I don't know how many people that'll end up convincing. I know some of the INT types would probably be like, oh, I'm going to challenge that to heck and back. But hopefully most of you would get the general idea. And I think that would probably help you with a lot of people going forward. I know it really helped me with my INFJ friends, and I hope you can experience similar levels of smooth communication. So with that, thank you very much for watching. I'd like to give a special shout out to Matthew Rakowski, Sploon Ghost, and Splatcat, my patrons, for supporting me financially during this time, especially if Mission Trip in 2023 ends up happening. That'll really add up. And if you all want to join my Patreon, the link is in the description. And until the next time, remember to keep the faith, stay epic, and God bless. Bye.